Now, we started to get reports in the last week of the season leading up to this past Sunday that due to them missing the playoffs, that Jim Caldwell was going to be shown the door by the Detroit Lions after 4 seasons at the helm. And ultimately it came to pass after the Lions beat the Packers on Sunday, finishing with a 9-7 record, but finishing out of the playoffs. He ultimately was fired by the organization. And I guess I get and understand why Lions fans might be happy about it, might be somewhat enthusiastic about it. They're not necessarily saying that Caldwell was a total bum, but they feel like you were only going to get so far with Jim Caldwell. They felt like he didn't get as much out of that team as you potentially could have with somebody else, somebody that was a better motivator, more capable from an X's and O's standpoint. So I kind of get it. And I also get the frustration of you're knocking on the door of the playoffs for a second straight season and potentially the third time in 4 years, and then it just all falls apart in that Week 16 game against Cincinnati when you had no business losing to them clowns whatsoever. So I get it and I understand it. But for me, this is kind of a so-so move. Look, this has probably been a long time coming. Like, you look at it, Caldwell got there in 2014, they made the playoffs. 2015, if you remember, they had that disastrous start. You had that Black Monday where Martha Ford was walking around firing all types of people throughout the organization. The offensive coordinator got fired. And it was looking like Caldwell might have been done after that season if things continued that way. But the team responded in the second half of the year, played much better. Then they make the playoffs, and again in 2016, here 2017, there was a real opportunity for the Lions to pounce and take advantage of a situation and perhaps get into the playoffs again for a third time in 4 years. And it didn't happen. And I can understand where you feel like you kind of peak. I also understand that Bob Quinn, who is now the executive vice president and general manager of the Detroit Lions, coming in from the New England Patriots after spending a decade and a half there in their front office, he didn't hire Jim Caldwell. And he was brought in before the start of the 2016 season. He inherits a coach that he didn't hire. And in a lot of cases, general managers in those type of situations, they look for the first opportunity to fire the current head coach and bring in their own guy. And I understand that. Because ultimately, part of the reason you are being hired as a new general manager is because the previous general manager failed, and typically that means that previous general manager failed not only at drafting, but potentially in terms of hiring the head coach. Well, the previous general manager didn't fail in hiring the head coach, but drafting, different story. But you look at Bob Quinn, and you're saying to yourself, do you want to continue to tie your future, your career path, to Jim Caldwell? Especially when you didn't have the insight or the decision-making ability to bring him in to begin with because you weren't in your role at the time. I get it. It happens all the time. We see it. So I understand. But I really wonder, Lions fans, how much better will you really be off with, let's say, somebody like a Matt Patricia or a Josh McDaniels, whichever New England guy Bob Quinn's going to be hot for to bring in as his next head coach, probably Matt Patricia. How much better do you think you are really going to be, especially if it is Patricia? Because let's face it, he's going to be a defensive coordinator coming from the Belichick coaching tree, where Belichick is ultimately the guy that runs that defense, and everybody damn good and well knows it, and especially knowing that a lot of those coaches from the New England Patriots, Bill Belichick coaching tree don't particularly do that well as head coaches on their own at the NFL level. See Romeo Crennel, see Eric Mangini, see Josh McDaniels, and some might argue see Bill O'Brien, just as a few notable examples. I mean, how much better was your team really going to be than the 9-7 it was this year? How much better is your team really than the wild card team they were 2 of the past 3 seasons before this one, and probably perhaps should have been this year? I mean, you're tied to a franchise quarterback that people call Stat Padford because he pads his stats in meaningless situations, in meaningless games. He consistently fails to show up big against big-time opponents at big-time games. How far do you think you're going to go with Matthew Stafford? Combine that with a team that a couple of seasons ago lost Calvin Johnson, then still made the playoffs the year after they lose a borderline Hall of Fame receiver in Megatron, that can't run the football a lick, that allowed Ndamukong Suh to leave in free agency. How much more successful when you honestly look at that Lions roster? It is an 8-10 win football team that maybe makes the first round of the playoffs, has one competitive playoff game, and ultimately loses. That's who they are. And I understand maybe the thought is a coach comes in and changes that and makes them better, but at some point in time, you've got to have some better Jimmies and Joes to go along with perhaps better motivation and better X's and O's. And where are those better Jimmies and Joes coming from? Where are those better X's and O's coming from? Sometimes it's one of those things, you have to be careful what you wish for because you just might get it, and then when you do get it, you realize that you don't particularly like the taste of it. And I just wonder for Lions fans, as antsy as they were perhaps to move on from Jim Caldwell because you hadn't won a playoff game, you have the disappointment of losing to a Bengals team that for all intents and purposes had quit on their season, that you were better than, you should have been able to beat. I get it. You look at Caldwell and you say he's not an exciting type of personality. He just kind of goes with it, and you want more out of him at times. They do some frustrating things. They just refuse to commit to running the football. A lot of different things. I get why Lions fans wanted a change, but sometimes you want change for the sake of change, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's better. You're ultimately going to get that change, and we will see what happens from here. But if I'm a Lions fan, I'm nervous a little bit about what Bob Quinn is going to do, especially if it is bringing in somebody like Matt Patricia from the Belichick Patriots coaching tree, because that hasn't exactly produced great results at the NFL level. It just hasn't. History backs me up on that. So I understand Caldwell's gone. And this is probably an inevitability because ultimately Bob Quinn, the general manager, didn't hire him. And that makes sense and I get it. It's just because you can fire somebody doesn't mean you should always fire somebody. And it doesn't automatically mean that that was the right decision to make. And I wonder if that's what Lions fans are going to look back and think in another season or two. Maybe not. Maybe somebody's brought in and they take over that division. It's possible. But again, think about it this way. How far are you truly going to go past what you have been with Matthew Stafford as your franchise quarterback?